course, any donations to the two sustainability groups in Bristol, either Clifton Climate Action or the BCR Energy Group, would be very much appreciated. If you donate through the PayPal account, actually, I don't think I've put up the address there. It's PayPal.
PayPal.me/Clifton Climate Action. I'll put it in the
right. .me. Right. Okay. Dorian's going to put it in the chat box. So so please do look for that, and any donations to that will be split between the two groups. Sure, most of you were at the event on Monday, and this is just a brief recap of what we covered then. What we discussed was the fact that weapons were the first primary aim of nuclear, our nuclear program, and electricity came secondary to that. A very important point to note, particularly when we look at whether carbon is cost effective, or affordable, whether it's low in emissions, whether it gives us security of supply. Remember that we're now mining ore of a very, very low density of about 0.01% in some cases across the world, and that we're dependent on very few countries for those supplies. We also discussed that we've had our first generation of nuclear power plants in the UK, which is the Magnox plants, and they're all closed now. And it's the second generation, the AGRs, the advanced gas-cooled reactors, that are operating at the moment and producing close to 20% of our electricity. Hinckley Point C will be the first of our third generation, a new generation completely. But of course, we're no closer to finding a solution to our disposal of waste. And that's a growing problem. Certainly the geology is all wrong in this country. And that is becoming an extremely expensive issue for us, as it is for many countries. So that's kind of what we covered on Monday. So tonight we're going to really talk more. We talked about the history of and the infrastructure that we have in the UK. Tonight we're going to talk more about where we are with energy policy now, nuclear energy policy now, and how we got there. Okay, and then we'll sort of recap at the end and look again, is it low carbon? Is it affordable? Is it secure? Is it safe? So how did our nuclear program start? Well, as we saw on Monday, 1956, the Queen opened our first nuclear power station at Calder Hall, what we now call Sellafield. And almost immediately it was beset by huge problems. We had the Windscale fire in 1957. And this was a fire that raged for about 3 days, blowing radioactive particles all over the place. And it's interesting to note that this was actually, it seems, the result of a political decision. It was Winston Churchill who was really pushing the power plant to produce as much plutonium as possible, even though the senior management were saying that this was becoming unsafe. And I believe at least one manager actually resigned over this before the fire started. But it was, again, it's interesting to see that it was that demand for fuel for our nuclear weapons program that really caused this disaster. It was because Winston Churchill wanted us to get our weapons sorted before a test ban treaty was brought in. So that's how that happened. But it's certainly one of our big disasters. And amazingly, I've certainly heard people from the nuclear industry in this country say we've never had a major disaster. Well, we have. And of course, there are the others like Dounreay that we discussed on Monday. But in fact, of course, generally over the decades since we started our nuclear program and other countries started theirs, the shine has definitely gone off nuclear. We've had roughly 33 serious incidents and accidents between the early 50s and 2011, including 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl. And of course, our own advanced gas-cooled reactor program, that second generation, was a bit of a disaster. They all overran, they were all over budget. There were major problems with them. It was never the export industry that we hoped it would be. And then, of course, we note the cost of managing all this and the fact that our AGRs, which we haven't even begun to decommission, are going to be at least 5 times the cost of each Magnox plant. Now we've got 14 of those to decommission. This is already an enormous part of the budget that's allocated towards energy, and our AGRs are going to be a major extra burden on that. And there's no way of avoiding that now. We have it, and they have to be decommissioned, as we talked about on Monday. We're no closer to a geological disposal facility. We want to put the stuff underground, but we can't find the right place. And in general, so what happened was that the shine went off nuclear, and by the mid-90s, our last one was built, Sizewell B, an American design, and that was kind of, for a short while, for about a decade, that was sort of the end of nuclear in the UK. It kind of went out of the news, and nobody was talking about new nuclear. And in fact, in 2003, we had a government energy white paper which described nuclear as economically unattractive. Really, by then, renewables and efficiency measures were coming onto the agenda, and those appeared, even to the government, a much better way to go. But by it really was a sort of bust to boom scenario. And many of you, I'm sure, will be aware that there was this sudden reawakening, this sudden explosion of discussion about nuclear and new nuclear and how good it would be and how necessary it was, sort of around the mid-2000s. And it very much coincided with the discussion about peak oil and so on. And of course, there was much lobbying. We now know that a consultation that was presented to the Labour government at the time was actually done by a company in the employ of EDF, but still that consultation held a lot of sway. Quite damningly, but not many people know this, who was head of EDF's communications at the time? It was Andrew Brown, Gordon Brown's brother. And, you know, again, it's very hard to think that there wasn't some persuasion going on there over that Christmas dinner table, I guess. But anyway, by one way or another, towards the late 2000s, the industry had persuaded the government that they could build a new generation of nuclear power plants without subsidy. And in 2009, Miliband gave the go-ahead for that, for 12 reactors on 10 different sites. And he did this by setting up a new system, and it's called the Contracts for Difference. And this is how we get our wind and most of our new infrastructure sorted. The infrastructure where we don't want the taxpayer to be responsible for the upfront costs, and that's certainly the case for nuclear. So the deal with the Contracts for Difference is that the industry is given a high strike price, and you'll have heard that term in association with Hinckley, that we basically guarantee the investors a high return. They're going to be able to sell their electricity at a guaranteed high cost for a period to come, and it could be 10, 20, 30 years, 30 years in the terms for Hinckley. And for that is used to incentivize the private investment to come in. So technically, we as taxpayers don't take on the risk of the actual construction and the overcosts and the overruns, but we do end up paying a much, much higher electricity price for that. So that's how that all came about, and it seemed like a good decision at the time, apparently. But then came Fukushima, and Fukushima really changed everything for the industry. In fact, I believe it's a disaster that's still continuing. The costs now look like $1 trillion just to sort out this one disaster, but not closed yet. And it really made the whole industry have to reassess their safety standards and look again at their practices and so on. And it certainly put the costs up, and it certainly made it much less attractive for many, many governments, including the Japanese, of course. And even by 2012, there's the CEO of General Electric, which has been a pioneer in nuclear power, saying that the economics of nuclear no longer work, that the others are gas and renewables are just too competitive, and there is no point in going down the route of more nuclear. But our government has gone down the route of more nuclear. So I'm going to just take a two minutes to sort of try and look at it from the government's point of view and why they've done it. And I think perhaps the first reason is it comes back to the fact that we've left this transition so very late. The government has been faced and is still faced with the fact that 2/3 of our conventional thermal power plants, coal, gas, nuclear, will be offline by 2030. And no government wants to be around when the lights go off. And so it's been, I think there's a lot of bad decision making happening because they're having to make decisions very quickly. You know, if we'd started doing this back in the 90s, we would have perhaps made a better set of decisions. But that, I would say, that's possibly something of what's going on. And the government, of course, committed to nuclear when the costs looked doable, and it looked like we could offload much of the construction risk to the private sector. So that seemed like a good deal at the time. And I guess we all know that government isn't good at changing policy. Once they've committed to it, they've committed to it. And even though new things, new factors have come into play with nuclear in particular, such as the risk of cyber attacks and terrorism, the loss of, nuclear waste from storage above ground, and the fact that the consortiums that they've tried to put together to finance new nuclear have fallen apart again and again until we're left really with just EDF and the Chinese. And nobody, I think, thinks that allowing the Chinese so close to such sensitive infrastructure is a good idea, but they are now pretty much our only option. I think you have to say, and we will come on and talk about this, and we did briefly the other day, it's very much linked to our weapons system, and the government certainly does not want to lose that cross-fertilization of technology and research base that leads to our own nuclear weapons. And it's very much to do with our status on the Security Council. You can't be on the Security Council if you're not a nuclear weapons state. And the French have been in the similar position. You know, they've really shored up their nuclear in order to maintain their status, their political status. And you have to say that there's been enormously powerful lobbying on the part of the nuclear lobby, and huge institutional inertia. I mean, it was interesting. I was talking to somebody who's been working inside BASE, our government's business and industry department. And as he said, and he's somebody who really works in the energy sector specifically, is that nuclear sits pretty much alone within that sector, and it is a sort of law unto itself. And I sort of hark back to an interview I heard with Michael Meacher, an energy secretary under the Labour government in the late 90s, basically saying even as Secretary of State, he could not get independent analysis of the nuclear industry. It was just impossible to get. The civil servants were completely in that mindset that it was necessary, and that there was no way for him, even as Secretary of State, to question it. And it seems like, I mean, obviously I don't work in government and most of us don't, but it seems from what we hear that there's still that mindset very much, and that nuclear is a kind of firmly entrenched rule within the civil service. And of course, so much of the argument has been about baseload. So again, just to see it from the government's point of view, what they've wanted is that sort of steady churning out of energy, whatever happens. That's how they've looked at what we call baseload. But of course, actually, what that doesn't take account of is our changing grid and our changing consumption patterns, which particularly with COVID have changed even more so. And what we really need now is a dynamic grid where we manage demand in association with managing production. And nuclear, that sort of steady baseload doesn't really allow for that. And in fact, what's been happening more and more, and last year it happened a lot, even in December, which is quite extraordinary, is that we are simply just producing too much electricity, even though we have interconnectors to export it where we can. There has been no demand. It's often on summer nights. And I was very surprised to hear that this was also happening in December, last December. But we basically go into negative prices. Literally, you're paying people to take electricity off your hand, and paying companies and individuals to consume more. With nuclear, what do you have to do? You can't turn off the nuclear reaction. So what do? You have to just stop it producing electricity, turn off the turbines, but then dump the heat. And apparently, I read in the Financial Times, but it is informally in comment, so I haven't had this corroborated, but I've read it more than once, that we pay around £10,000 per megawatt hour just to dump the heat. That's literally into the atmosphere or in as hot water, without producing electricity at all. So there are many arguments against baseload, but baseload is still an argument that really holds sway with the government. It's like a comfort blanket, really. You know, if you know it's just churning out, you know something's still going to work, I guess. There's the way the government looks at it, but not all the lights are going to go off. Anyway, so back to the sort of the flow of things. Government has gone ahead, despite Fukushima, despite all the warnings and the costs, and committed us to a whole new generation of nuclear power plants. But in the last 2 years, of course, we've seen massive holes appear in these, and our government has done everything it can to plug them. So Hinckley is going ahead, but disastrously, and we'll come on and talk about that. But this one here, Sellafield, it's actually what they renamed it Moorside, so that it appeared perhaps a little bit more acceptable than Sellafield. And Toshiba, of course, got into big financial trouble. They were the lead investors on that. They were they ran into big trouble over 2 nuclear plants that they were operating or building over in the US, and it pretty much, along with a bit of fraud within the company, actually bankrupted them, and they've pulled out of Moorside. And our government has done everything, including ditching the principle that we as taxpayers do not pay the construction costs. They've come up with what we call here, bottom right, regulated asset base, RAB, which is a clever accountancy way of making sure that the taxpayer, you and I, do pay for the construction risk and the construction costs. But even with that, we haven't managed to find a new investor for that particular plant. And it really is now sort of officially off the books. It's not going to happen. The same with Wilfer, the next one at the Isle of Anglesey. Again, Hitachi withdrew from that, just saying in the end, the cost just didn't make sense to them at all. They couldn't go ahead with it. And again, our government threw the book at it, tried to get them back on board, but that one also appears to have died. And with that one has gone Oldbury as well. So we now have a massive hole in our nuclear programme. What we've got is Hinckley underway, and the next 2 on the block are Sizewell and Bradwell. So let's look at Hinckley. Hinckley is, of course, 2 pressurized water reactors of 1.6 gigawatts each. And if you're not used to the gigawatt thing, just very, very roughly, the UK has about 100 gigawatts of generating capacity now. It's gone up a lot in the last few years with more renewables. And at a time, on a cold winter's night, very, very roughly, at peak hours of consumption, we'd be consuming around 50 gigawatts. In fact, we've been, with lockdown, our consumption patterns have changed, and actually that's a little bit less this year, but that's kind of where it lies. So to be adding 3.2 gigawatts is a relatively small part of our consumption. Okay, so there we are. Hinckley is based on, it's a European pressurized water reactor, and it's based on, there are 3 others that have been built across the world or are in the process of being built. In the case of Flamanville, all of them pretty disastrous. So Flamanville, you may know about, it's very close to Jersey. It's on the French coast there, very close to the UK. Again, it is the one that actually our contract at Hinckley relies upon it being finished. It was originally 3.3 billion. Now the latest costs that I've read are about 12.4 billion. It was supposed to be online in 2012. Now they're talking about 2024 at the earliest. And this is the bit that really worries me about nuclear as somebody looking at this. They were discovered to be putting in flawed steel in the reactor in 2015, and they knew that they had this problem. They knew they were putting in flawed steel, but they continued building. Now, this is to me the recklessness of this industry. And the French regulators did put a complete stop on Flamanville for a while they discussed what to do. And there was the potential that they were going to ask for the whole thing to be stripped out and started again. What I'm told by insiders in the industry now is that the deal is, bizarrely, they've allowed the construction to continue, but that flawed steel will have to be, they will have to stop production again and take out the flawed steel by 2024. Now the actual start date for Flamanville itself has been put back to 24. I guess that puts everything into alignment. But, you know, a kind of crazy situation, really. Again, the next line here about the rewelding of inspected joints. I mean, it appears that ED, you know, very poor scrutiny of their own work and going ahead when they knew that they had problems. Again, they've had to re-weld a whole load of joints. That's not what you want to hear about a nuclear power plant. So again, very worrying. Olkiluoto in Finland is another one of the same design. Again, a huge overrun, huge overcost, 3 billion, but eventually got built for about 8.5 billion, was supposed to be online in 2010, but eventually came online last year. but went off again in an emergency situation with radiation leaks last December. Now, who of us knew that there were radioactive leaks from Olkiluoto last December? Probably none of us. And this has been the cause of, over the years now, multi-billion lawsuits between the Finns and the French. So again, really, really problematic, this whole design. Taishan in China is the other one. And again, it's quite clear that there have been design and building flaws with this. And there's, certainly stuff on YouTube saying that it's been put into production without full testing and so on. Being China, we don't get to hear all the full facts on this. But as far as we know, it is operating. We don't know if it's operating at full capacity and so on. But pretty much a sort of a catalogue of disasters, really. And Hinckley is certainly set to be the most expensive power plant in the world. EDF is the deal is that the EDF is the lead investor, and the China CNG has a third portion of it. And the figures have gone up and up. We're now looking at somewhere close to 25 billion to get this operating. We were supposed to be cooking our Christmas dinners on Hinckley electricity in 2017, but of course now it looks like it's going to be about 10 years later than that it actually comes into operation, if it does so. And of course, again, the thing that's really hit the news is that very expensive strike price that we've guaranteed this consortia, £92.50, when actually our electricity prices now are, as I say, sometimes actually going negative. But of course, there are other costs involved with Hinckley as well, debt guarantees and so on, and the cost of integrating this into our grid. And our audit office has calculated the subsidy at about 30 billion. And in fact, it was interesting reading Nick Butler in the Financial Times, who's been the energy correspondent for many years and a very conservative man. And his point was 2 or 3 years ago, he said, as did many men in suits. So it wasn't just the weird lefties who were saying this, but many men in suits were saying, just sign a no-fault deal and walk away, close down Hinckley. This is now becoming ridiculous. But of course, we didn't do that. What we did do, it was interesting, when Mrs. May came into power, you may remember, she did put a halt on it for about 3 months. And there was the potential that we were going to stop the construction of Hinckley. But finally, it went ahead. The deal was done. And what we know is that, of course, with the Hinckley deal came the agreement that China would build its own design of reactor at Bradwell and would be the majority stakeholder there, and that it would have a third of the deal at Sizewell as well. But there's very little transparency over that deal. But anyway, it went ahead. I think one of the things that has been perhaps the biggest threat to EDF, or has seemed to be the biggest threat at different times, is actually the state of the company's finances. It's really a bankrupt company, EDF. Their obligations are way above their actual market capitalization. Their share value, that graph there shows their share chart, and it really has plummeted over the last few years. They have got huge responsibilities for their own, I think it's 54 or 57 nuclear power plants in France. They've got to extend the life of several of them. They've still got to build their own geological disposal facility, and EDF is actually responsible for that in France, unlike us in our country, where we're responsible as taxpayers for building the GDF. And the only way that it has survived really is by the French government owning it. But even there are signs over the last year, the French government really having had enough with EDF being a drain on the state's finances. And there's now talk about actually splitting EDF into 2 companies. But I mean, from what you will probably remember is while there was all this discussion about whether Hinckley would go ahead, the finance director himself resigned, basically saying, this is crazy, Hinckley will destroy EDF, it will bankrupt EDF. And the French unions themselves went on strike saying, why are we bankrupting EDF to produce to create a power plant in the UK? So they've, EDF staggers on, but with, of course, the French government buying owning most of the shares. And every time EDF puts out a bond to get more money from the private sector, the French government buys, at least 2/3 of it, which allows the sort of institutional investors to buy the rest. And so it does stagger on. So at the moment, EDF is paused to build Sizewell and pushing to start this at the end of 2021. And you will know that there are quite a few protest movements over there. Interestingly, there are some, if you look online, there are some movements quite the opposite who want to support this, see it as a jobs charter. So, you know, that's another thing that has to be tackled, I guess, is the perception that the only, you know, that we have to rely on conventional industries like this to provide jobs, when that really is not or should not be the case anymore. When we have a transition to go through, a green transition, there should be plenty of jobs out there, but we need the government to support those. Bradwell and obviously the Chinese design that I mentioned, that's in the sort of approval process at the moment, but looks like it's set to get approval. Interestingly, what has come up over the last few years is that the stronger and stronger warnings about the risks of letting the Chinese build this and being so close to such sensitive infrastructure. And in fact, the US government under Trump basically said that they would start excluding us from certain, you know, foreign policy groups and sharing of information if we allowed the Chinese to get so involved in our nuclear program. And certainly there are plenty of MPs who are quite exercised about this. But at the moment, it seems like it is going ahead. There was one report out in the Financial Times saying that the Chinese, because of this sensitivity, might accept a minority share in Bradwell, but I think it would still be their design. So I think the question, so that's where we are at the moment in terms of our nuclear program. But remember, just going back to the basic figures, we have to close down several of our power plants. They're all running at very low capacity at the moment, but these 2024, 2023, we've got you know, 8 there that need to come off very quickly, and another 2 to come down in 2028. So, and then more in 2030. So basically our program, apart from Sizewell B, really has to be shut down by 2030. Does it matter? Well, we're going to lose. I've just took this screenshot from at the bottom right there from Gridwatch this morning, and you could see, again, just to put it in context, nuclear at the moment is only producing just over 4 gigawatts. That's on a really cold winter's day, you know, and we're managing with such a low output from nuclear. What strikes me is why, given that this lot has to come off, and the only thing that could potentially step back in as nuclear is Hinckley, because nothing else is going to be ready on time, and even it's debatable whether Hinckley will, we are definitely going to have a really big dip in our electricity generation from nuclear over the next few years. Why would we go back to relying on nuclear? Why, you know, it doesn't really make sense. It doesn't make sense cost-wise or any otherwise. And just to note that in our contracts for difference auction that we'll be holding this autumn, our government expects to be commissioning another 12 gigawatts from renewables. So, you know, 4 gigawatts in nuclear, really, we should be able to manage that going offline and not being replaced. Now, I've put this graph up here, this pie chart, just because, of course, we do have some other priorities with our generation. We definitely want to get that coal off, and we want to get that gas off as well, because that is another hydrocarbon. So we still have this massive challenge to get rid of all this off our grid. But I don't think, to me, that justifies going ahead with a new nuclear program that is going to take, you know, another 10 to 15 years to build Bradwell and Sizewell, I would think, given by current standards. One of the things our government's hoping for, of course, and we discussed this briefly on Monday, is that small modular reactors, SMRs, sort of flat pack nuclear reactors, will bridge the gap or come in there. But even Rolls-Royce don't think they won't have done the basic research till 2025. These aren't going to be a speedy reaction, nor are they cheap. The idea behind SMRs is that they should be a lot cheaper than building a whopping great Hinckley or whatever. But if you look at the costs, you know, Rolls-Royce are saying they need, you know, another 1.6 billion for research, 2.1 billion to build the first one, and that will only be about 300 megawatts. That is really not a big plant. And then 1.8 billion for the subsequent. Now, of course, with nuclear, we can certainly say it will cost more than that. We can absolutely say that we need to expand on those original estimates. This is not a cost-effective technology. But our government is still giving them money to do the research on this. We've just done it, in fact, as part of our 10-point plan. So to me, as I say, it looks like a bung to Rolls-Royce, which is a really failing company. And I don't think anyone really expects, in fact, even the World Nuclear Report does not expect SMRs to be cost effective, cost viable, or to be any part of the future nuclear scenario. But our government is going there and bugging the money. So, and yeah, I mean, just to reiterate, Rolls-Royce is saying that they, even if they could get these SMRs up and running, that possibly by the late 2020s, they could be producing electricity at £60 per megawatt hour. Well, we were already producing renewables much cheaper than that, and the price is going down. So why would we go through this with all the hassle of building small nuclear plants all over the country, around every city, to produce electricity that's more expensive than we can actually produce now from renewables? Again, it just doesn't make sense. And I think really the government, if they haven't learned anything from the whole shale disaster, then they should. I think there will be huge, it's quite clear that SMRs are hugely unpopular. And if the government tries to site nuclear power plants all around every city, they're going to run into a lot of trouble. I think a lot of local protest. The other one that's suddenly come up rather surprisingly, or at least surprisingly to me, it's sort of been on the horizon as the sort of holy grail of energy production, is nuclear fusion, which is quite different to fission. So this is actually fusing atoms rather than splitting them. And there's been a huge amount of research collaboratively by many countries, of which we were part, into ITER in southern France. And that picture there on the top right is that centre there where that research has been happening. It looks to me that now that we're out of Brexit and we're out of Euratom, I believe, it looks like the government has decided that we need to pursue our own independent fusion research. And suddenly they've put out to tender looking for a site to do this. Cumbria, Moorside has applied. I think Oldbury has applied, and God knows where else. But remember, the reason why fusion has not happened so far is because you have to generate a temperature of something like 150 million degrees. And so the question is, how do you get more energy out than you actually put in? That is the big problem, the big dilemma for nuclear fusion, and how you contain that heat, and then how you integrate that into a grid. So there are many, many questions about it. From talking to people in the nuclear industry, it's still decades away. Nobody thinks nuclear fusion is around the corner. It could be, I mean, as one academic from Bristol University put it to me, we might have a prototype by the late 2040s. We might have something into production in the 2050s. Well, that's a time span that's absolutely meaningless. It's meaningless in terms of what our country needs. It's meaningless in terms of climate change, and it's meaningless in terms of planning and costs and so on. And just a note, of course, that although people tend to think of fusion as being totally free of waste, it appears from what I've read on the web, and I'm not going to claim to be a nuclear scientist, is that still the buildings and machinery will have a radioactive half-life. It's only for about 100 years, as opposed to the hundreds of thousands to millions of years that our current nuclear waste has. So that's certainly an improvement, but it's not as if it's totally free of waste. So, and just to say that, of course, there are many other areas of nuclear research going on. Bill Gates is backing quite a few of them. And as I mentioned the other day, there's certainly a move back towards looking at thorium as a possible fuel source for more conventional power plants. So kind of that's where we are with our nuclear program. Oh, well, somebody asked me actually I'll come on to that in a second. What we said we would set out to try and answer is whether nuclear is low carbon, is it cost effective, and does it give us a secure supply of energy, and is it safe for us, and safe in the sort of broad range of things in terms of cybersecurity and so on. So let's just have a look at those questions. So let's look at energy security first of all. And this impacts on the cost effectiveness as well. Remember, we've got about 420 nuclear plants operating around the world. And yet we are already, as I keep saying, already I think about 7 to 10% of the world's uranium comes from Namibia, where we're mining at 0.01%, i.e. we throw away 99.99% of the ore. And that we're only going downwards from there. We're only going down into less dense ore. We're not going upwards. 20% is the absolute best we can do, and there's very little of that around. So this is, so in terms of energy security and energy supply and costs, this isn't a good picture. And so in terms of, do we have enough uranium? Well, at the current rate, it really depends. There are so many different factors here, whether those 420 plants, which pretty much all of them have to be closed by 2050, are they going to be replaced, and so on. So there are lots of different questions to ask here. But it looks like at the current rate, if we do replace what we say we're going to replace as a world, we will be mining at 0.005% by the end of the century, i.e. more energy in than we get out. There are issues also to do with the control of graphite, which is very much under Chinese control at the moment, and the exotic metals that we need for the containment vessels. So there are lots of issues here about whether we actually have enough and whether the resources justify continuing this industry. I think also it's worth noticing, I mean, I was just staggered by these figures when I read them, that a nuclear power plant in this country will take in a billion gallons of water a day, each major plant. And you can see there in California, it's about 2.5 billion gallons for theirs. Now, given again that we have drought, and as we discussed on Monday, certainly the French had to close down several of their nuclear power plants when we've had, in 2018, when we had big heat wave and drought. And in Texas, of course, now it's actually they've had to close down for other reasons, in that there isn't water, it's turned to ice, and the gas itself has frozen and gone to ice as well. And so they've had to close down their nuclear power plants for those reasons. But this is going forward and thinking about climate change, the idea that this amount of water can be just put through a nuclear power plant and then dumped as hot water out to sea again is not a sensible way to go forward, I think. And then there's that other issue about sea level rise, which we discussed. We're looking at sea level rise of between 1 metre and 1.5 metres by the end of this century. And this is a picture of Sizewell, which is typical with its low shelving beach. You know, this really has implications for our nuclear security. So is it low carbon? Okay, well, I can only go by the figures that are out there from some of our top scientists. Our Committee on Climate Change say that all new power generation from 2030 at least, and I suspect they've brought that figure forward, should be less than 50 grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilowatt hour. And if you look on GridWatch, you'll actually see the calculation of what our grid is generating in terms of CO2 at any point in time. What is nuclear? How does nuclear measure into that? The estimates are incredibly wide, as I put there, between 3 and 220 grams of kilowatt of carbon dioxide equivalent. Our government claims it's about 6, which is definitely on the low end. Keith Barnum, who's head of physics at Imperial College, he's done a big review of full life cycle analysis of nuclear, and states quite clearly that it is well over 50 grams, as has Benjamin Sovacool and Ian Fairley, and you can find all their figures online. They're not, I mean, it's not dramatically over if you know, compared to burning coal, for example, or burning gas, but it's certainly over the target that we want to be at, that we need to be at. So it's not quite where we want to be. And I think the other point to put in there, again, it goes back to that density of ore. That's on a calculation of the ore that we're using now, but it's not looking forward to the kind of low level ore that we'll be mining in 20, 30, 40 years time. And again, you know, 37% of our uranium ore is less than 0.05%. And by the 2090s, we'll be mining at 0.005% potentially. So, you know, that changes the figures quite dramatically on whether this is a low carbon source of fuel. And interesting just to note on that, there's a new company just set up I think 2 years ago called Yellow Cake on the London Stock Exchange, and this is a bunch of investors who are betting on the fact that the cost of uranium is going to go up hugely because the demand will go up, and it's going to be so much harder to extract it. So so they're actually betting on that, which I guess these are people who kind of know what they're doing. They're putting their money there. So is it low carbon? No. Is it secure? I don't think so. But there are many ways of judging that. I don't think in terms of physical geography, it's a secure technology. And looking at our climate change, as I say, is it cost effective? Is it something that that pays its way in terms of other energy sources? No, it's quite clearly not. And what it is an absolute hockey stick in terms of costs. So as you can see there, in 2002, we had a white paper that estimated the costs at about 48 billion. By 2008, that had gone up to 74.9 billion. Up to 110 billion by 2014, and now the estimate, again, if you look at the government's website, they say it's anywhere between about 124 billion and 232 billion. So this is quite extraordinary, and this is just to manage our existing sites, including Sellafield and Dounreay, which we discussed on Monday, but not including the management of our current generation of nuclear plants, the advanced gas cooled reactors. And we know that they are going to be incredibly expensive to decommission. And we've got a whole new lot of challenges there. So no, this is an extremely expensive industry. And somebody on Monday just asked me about what the costs of renewables to compare. I haven't had a lot of time to look at this, but what I would suggest, if anybody does want to do that, go away and look for things like offshore wind, our Hornsey offshore wind plants, for example, which are generating, sort of around 2 to 3 gigawatts each of them. It comes in a three-stage project. There's Hornsey 1, Hornsey 2, Hornsey 3, and they certainly cost between sort of 2 and 4 billion each. So they're not cheap generation. But remember, there are no fuel costs to that. There's no waste management costs after that, and these can be built within 2 or 3 years. They don't need 10, 15 years of huge amounts of cement and construction costs and so on. So, it is hard to compare like with like, but it is quite clear. And actually, I was watching just before before this evening's event, a very funny Fully Charged. If anybody hasn't looked at Fully Charged with the guy from Red Dwarf, him doing a particular little piece, a sort of 7-minute stint on Hinckley Point C, oh dearie me. And as he says, his calculation is that about 18 billion pounds will buy you about 12 gigawatts of offshore wind. And yeah, his point is that it's men in suits are saying this is ridiculous, that we shouldn't be doing this. The men from the city are saying this. So I guess we should take that on board. And we shouldn't forget, of course, those costly black swan events, because, as I say, Fukushima is now costing close to $1 trillion. Chernobyl cost about 160 billion, and we do keep having these incidents. As much as the industry would like to say they don't happen, they're black swan events, i.e. they're not built into the models, but they do keep happening. And I just think, for me, in the end, when I look at nuclear, and I have tried to approach this very, very objectively, it is this history of poor management of risks, the absolute recklessness of this industry, throwing stuff down a shaft, unmonitored, unrecorded, until it blows up, going ahead with construction when you're using faulty steel, and so on. Given the lifetime of nuclear and the fact that we have to manage this for such long periods, as in thousands of years, millions of years, why, when we've made such a mess of it, we've dumped waste at sea, we found ways around the rules and so on, why would we trust this industry to take us forward into a third generation? And I guess that's my real feel, is that this is a a moral issue of all the things that we are dumping on future generations with climate change and all the other crises that we face. Why would we embark on a third generation of nuclear when we have not solved the problems of the first two generations? To me, it's highly immoral. You know, we went into our nuclear power program believing what we believed, thinking it was necessary, thinking we would find a solution. We now know there isn't a solution to the waste problem, not a satisfactory one. Why would we think it was okay to go ahead with our third generation? And here we have, in fact, the boss of EDF. You know, I mean, if when the vice president of EDF is saying that actually renewables and demand management and storage are a better solution than nuclear, then you kind of have to take it on board. Yeah, and even our own National Infrastructure Committee saying go light on the nukes and heavy on renewables. You know, there are many other better solutions we have out there now than going down this route. And if you look at our research centre at Oxford, and what happens, the first page that comes up, it's all about weapons system. So if we want to understand why we're going ahead with this, you know, as our former outgoing Chancellor Hammond said, it is all to do with our credibility with the French and Chinese. And as our top scientists have said, reporting into Parliament, it is about maintaining that research base for our weapon systems, and it's very clearly to do with that. If you look at almost at the last slide here, if you look at the scientists' doomsday clock statement, remember what they are telling us is that we are 100 seconds to midnight. We don't have time to mess around now. We don't actually have time to think about, you know, the power sources that we're going to build in 15, 20 years time. What is this industry doing? It's actually pushing nuclear power onto the Middle East and onto Africa, which is quite extraordinary when you think about the water challenges in particular, but also the safety and the management issues here. And if you think about all the difficulties we have with Iran going through a civil power program and the possibility that that may lead on to a nuclear weapons program, why would we think it's a good idea that Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, for example, are becoming nuclear states? To me, again, it's ludicrous. Worrying, but there we go. Anyway, enough. So here we are back at the basic page. So thank you very much, and I hope you found that interesting, and I'm very happy to take questions. And please do donate to the two sustainability groups. I will just put one more slide there. If you know, people often say, don't tell us just the problems, tell us what we should do about it. And I suppose when you're looking at nuclear, there are some things you can do, which is, of course, I hope you've already done it, switch your energy supply to 100% renewable. Start looking at your own consumption. I hope it's not just start, I hope it's pursue it. Take the 10% challenge and then take another 10% challenge. Start cutting your power consumption where you can. Invest in community renewables, divest from fossil fuels and nuclear. Ask where your investments are. Cut your peak usage. For that generally means winter somewhere between 4 and 7 o'clock. That's not the time to do the vacuum cleaning and put on the tumble dryer. You know, the more we can bring down our peak usage, the more the less the government is under pressure to provide big power plants to meet those needs. And actually, bizarrely, what we've learned is that we're going to have to start using more on summer nights. So buy an electric vehicle is the answer for some of us. I guess that's going to happen quite naturally. And support groups that are active in this area: Southwest Against Nuclear, Radiation Free Lakeland, Stop Hinckley, and and support the Sizewell protesters, and so on. So I hope that's useful, and I'm going to come off screen sharing now. Right, I've been
just leave that on the screen.
I'll leave that on the screen. Okay, fine. All right.
Yeah, no, great. I've asked for people to put questions in the chat if they would like to do so. Just to say, Clifton Climate Action and the Bishopston, Cottam and Redland Energy Group have a talk tomorrow all about plastic pollution. We've got talks in March on palm oil and the emissions from shipping. But if you didn't fancy the talk on plastic pollution tomorrow, Roland has asked that I mention a talk which explores the further links between nuclear power and nuclear weapons, organised by Salisbury CND. Speakers are Dr. Andy Sterling and Dr. Phil Johnston, and it's chaired by Nikki Clark. If you look up Salisbury CND, I'm sure you'll be able to find out how to get tickets. But we've had a couple of other questions come in. So I think you may have covered this later. This one came in fairly early, but this one's about EDF own all the AGRs. Do they pay all or part of the cost of decommissioning them?
I think they pay, no, they don't pay all the costs. We will be paying a substantial part of the decommissioning costs. In this country, I believe what happens is that they have to pay into a fund, which is supposed to help with decommissioning costs at the end. But it is very clear that we as taxpayers will be paying them a major part of the liability.
Has the UK begun to create an effective regulation and inspection regime to replace Euratom?
Interesting question, and I'm not sure I can answer that. Yes, I mean, one of the big bit of consternation when we voted for Brexit was what happened about Euratom, because we were under their regulation, and it was almost impossible to think about how we would source uranium safely, and you know, we were very much reliant on Euratom's inspection regime. I think it was they who discovered many of the problems at Sellafield and so on. But I'm not quite sure. What I know is that it takes about what I've read is that it takes about 5 years to train the level of inspector that is required. And of course, we haven't had 5 years to do that. I'm honestly not quite sure what's happened about our regulatory system and whether it's a little deficient at the moment. I couldn't honestly tell you, and I'd certainly be interested in hearing news from people inside the industry on that.
Yeah, for anyone who's in the meeting right now, David has posted a link if you want to join the CND talk tomorrow at 7 p.m. For anyone who's watching this on YouTube, it may already be too late, but just try Googling it. The only other question we've currently got in the chat is, well, not really a question even, it's just that TEPCO knew years before the tsunami that its sea defences at Fukushima were inadequate.
Right.
Do you want to comment on that?
Well, I'm not surprised. Yes, I can quite believe it. I mean, we know, you know, I guess you could say that we're in a similar position. It is quite clear from our scientific evidence that we are facing a meter sea level rise by the end of the century, if not more. And I don't see us doing what we need to do to protect our nuclear infrastructure. So I guess we're in a kind of similar position. As I say, I think this industry is incredibly reckless. One of the things that I remember from watching that Panorama program about Sellafield was the CEO who was in charge of Sellafield at the time, saying he was just so cool and laid back and saying, yes, they were making some adjustments for previous underinvestment. And it was just such an understatement when really what was being exposed was this real mess of a site being poorly managed and understaffed. And, you know, of course, we've also, I mean, I haven't gone into it, but we've had some major scandals in this country in the last 5-6 years. I think our government has had to dismiss 2 separate groups who were put in charge to manage Sellafield, and it's had to be brought back in-house under government control, just because both companies made such a mess of it and were charging such a phenomenal amount. Yeah, and then we had to pay them off. Well, who wrote those contracts? I don't know. But when those contracts were withdrawn because they were failing to deliver, we then ended up paying them hundreds of millions just to get out. You know, yeah, I just sort of despair, really.
One more question's come in. How does James Lovelock support nuclear options?
I don't know how James Lovelock supports nuclear options. I think it is quite extraordinary. The people who are wedded to nuclear are incredibly wedded to nuclear, and I suspect it's that thing that we're all slightly guilty of. It's what we learned when we were in our 20s holds good for the rest of our lives, even if the facts change. And the facts have changed with nuclear. You know, to keep going on about it. We're mining ore in more difficult circumstances, much lower density and so on. We've got the experience of so many more disasters under our belt, costly disasters in all ways. And I think it's very difficult for some people to actually change their mind or change their view. The fact that we haven't found a GDF and so on, it probably, you know, wasn't something that was in his original assessment. And I think he probably just hasn't updated himself. But yeah.
How will the oil industry diversifying into renewables affect the nuclear industry?
How will the oil industry diversifying into renewables? What affect the nuclear industry? I'm hard to say. I mean, obviously what's happening now, even with EDF, is that everybody understands they've got to get out of the technologies that they're in, the fossil fuels or nuclear, and move into renewables. And EDF is doing that just like BP and Shell and so on. And actually, interestingly, what happened with our most recent auction of offshore wind is that the price rose hugely because there was such huge demand from particularly our oil companies going in there and being willing to pay much higher prices just to get into offshore wind. So I guess what it should do is, as they start to compete for possible projects, is that they should start, we hope, to develop their own and expand the offerings and so on. But I'm not quite sure I can answer that in a better way.
I think that's it.
Okay.
I think that's it for questions. Clearly, you've done such a good job covering everything that no one else has any other queries.
Well, if anybody does have any queries, you're very welcome to write to me at nikkijones5@hotmail.com, and I will be happy to answer. But yeah, I hope you found that useful. Yeah, and well, thank you very much.